He ordered her to scrub the latrines because she looked like someone who'd wandered onto base by mistake. No chevrons, no unit patch, just a tired-looking woman in faded fatigues. But 15 minutes later, when her sleeve rolled up past her elbow while she was on her knees cleaning, and he spotted the ink wrapped around her forearm, that same lieutenant's blood turned to ice water. His hands started shaking because what he saw wasn't just some random tattoo. It was a mark that belonged to ghosts, legends, people who weren't supposed to exist anymore. Now, before we dive into exactly what went down in that latrine facility, smash that like button and drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. Because this lieutenant just learned the hardest lesson of his military career, preparing. And narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Staff Sergeant Maya Chen didn't look like much when she stepped off the transport truck that was scorching Tuesday morning. Desert boots worn down to practically nothing, cargo pants that had seen better days, and a plain olive drab t-shirt that hung loose on her small frame. No name tape, no rank insignia, no shiny accessories catching the Arizona sun. She moved with this quiet efficiency, like someone who knew exactly where she was going but didn't need to announce it to the world. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, neat but not fancy, and she carried herself with the kind of posture that said military training without screaming about it. The thing was, nobody at Fort Sentinel knew she was coming. The morning roster didn't have her name on it. The duty officer hadn't been briefed about any new arrivals. She just appeared at the main gate with a set of temporary orders that looked legitimate enough to get her through security, and then she vanished into the maze of buildings like smoke. Most of the enlisted personnel figured she was probably some kind of contractor, maybe a civilian tech specialist or an auditor from headquarters. The kind of person who shows up unannounced, does whatever mysterious job they're supposed to do, and disappears back into the bureaucratic machine. Maya found herself assigned to temporary quarters in the transient barracks, a long, low building that housed everyone from visiting officers to personnel waiting for permanent assignments. It wasn't much, just a narrow room with a metal cot, a wall locker, and a small desk, but she'd slept in worse places. A lot worse. She unpacked methodically, hanging her few civilian clothes in the locker and arranging her toiletries on the shelf above the small sink. Everything had its place. Everything organized with military precision, but there was something else there too. A carefulness like someone who'd learned not to get too comfortable anywhere. The first few days passed quietly. Maya would show up at the dining facility during off-peak hours, eat alone at a corner table, and then spend her time walking the perimeter of the base. Not obviously surveying or taking notes, just walking. She'd stop occasionally to examine a fence line or study the placement of security cameras, but if anyone asked, she'd just say she was getting familiar with the layout. Which was true, as far as it went. She had this way of blending into the background, of being present but not noticeable, that made most people forget they'd even seen her, but Lieutenant Marcus Webb noticed everything. Fresh out of officer candidate school, assigned to his first real command position, and absolutely determined to make his mark on Fort Sentinel. He was the kind of officer who showed up 30 minutes early to everything, who kept his uniform pressed to knife-edge sharpness, and who treated every interaction like a performance review. His boots gleamed, his hair was regulation perfect, and he wore his rank-like armor. The problem was, he'd never actually been tested, never faced real adversity, never had to make decisions that mattered beyond paperwork and duty rosters. Webb had been assigned as the officer in charge of base maintenance and security protocols, which meant he spent most of his time making sure trash got collected on schedule and fire extinguishers were properly inspected. It wasn't glamorous work, but he approached it with the intensity of someone planning a major military operation. He'd walk the base with a tablet, making notes about everything from scuffed paint to uneven concrete, building up a reputation as someone who didn't let anything slide. The enlisted personnel had started calling him Inspector Webb behind his back, though never where he could hear it. When Webb first spotted Maya during one of his routine patrols, something about her immediately rubbed him wrong. She was sitting on a bench outside the commissary, just watching the flow of personnel going about their daily business. Nothing threatening or suspicious, but she didn't fit any of the categories he was used to dealing with. Not obviously military, not obviously civilian, not obviously anything. And that uncertainty made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He started paying attention to her movements, noting when she showed up at the dining facility, where she went during the day, who she talked to, which was almost nobody. Maya had this talent for being friendly enough to avoid suspicion, but distant enough to discourage conversation. She'd nod politely to anyone who acknowledged her, answer direct questions with minimal but accurate responses, and then fade back into the background. It was like she'd perfected the art of being unremarkable. The more Webb observed her, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. In his mind, everyone on a military base should have a clear purpose, a defined role, a chain of command they reported to. Maya seemed to exist outside all of those structures, and that felt like a challenge to the order he was trying to maintain. He started checking with different departments, trying to figure out exactly what she was supposed to be doing there. But nobody seemed to have clear answers. Facilities management thought she might be with logistics. Logistics figured she was probably temporary personnel. And temporary personnel had no record of anyone matching her description. The morning everything changed started like any other. Maya was up before reveille, as was her habit, moving through her morning routine with quiet efficiency. She'd shower while the facilities were empty, dress in the same unremarkable clothes, and then walk to the dining facility for coffee and whatever passed for breakfast. But this particular morning, as she was walking back from her meal, she noticed something that made her pause. A section of perimeter fencing near the motor pool had been damaged, probably by a vehicle backing up too close, and the repair job looked sloppy. Dangerous even. The kind of thing that could create a security vulnerability if someone with bad intentions knew how to exploit it. Maya walked over to examine the fence more closely, running her fingers along the twisted metal and noting how the temporary repair had been done with the wrong gauge wire. It would hold under normal conditions, but any real stress would tear it apart. She pulled out her phone and took a few photos, not for any official purpose, just out of professional habit. Someone should know about this, should fix it properly before it became a real problem. But she wasn't sure who that someone should be, or how to report it without raising questions about what she was doing examining security barriers in the first place. That's when Lieutenant Webb came around the corner, tablet in hand, conducting his morning inspection routine. He spotted Maya immediately, crouched down by the fence with her phone out, and his security officer training kicked into high alert. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of suspicious behavior he'd been worried about. An unidentified person examining base security features, taking photographs. It didn't matter that the fence was clearly damaged and in need of repair. What mattered was that someone without clear authorization was documenting potential vulnerabilities. Webb approached with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from finally having a clear situation to handle. His boots struck the asphalt with military precision, and he'd already decided how this conversation was going to go before he opened his mouth. This was his moment to demonstrate leadership, to show that he could identify and neutralize potential security threats. He'd been waiting for something like this, an opportunity to prove that all his attention to detail and regulatory enforcement was actually protecting the base from real problems. Maya heard him coming. Of course, she'd been trained to be aware of her surroundings at all times, to note changes in the acoustic environment that might signal approaching danger. But she didn't turn around immediately, didn't want to seem defensive or guilty. Instead, she finished her examination of the fence, tucked her phone back into her pocket, and then stood up slowly, dusting off her knees. When she finally faced Webb, her expression was calm and neutral, the face of someone who had nothing to hide, but also nothing to prove. Webb stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to establish authority, but far enough back to maintain tactical advantage if things went sideways. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, not threatening exactly, but making it clear that he was prepared for any possibility. The morning sun was behind him, putting Maya in shadow and giving him what he thought was a psychological advantage. He'd read about interview techniques, about how positioning and lighting could influence the outcome of confrontations. "Excuse me, ma'am." Webb's voice cut through the morning air with practiced authority. "I need to see some identification." His tone carried that particular blend of politeness and steel that junior officers learn in leadership school, designed to sound reasonable while making it clear that compliance wasn't optional. Maya turned toward him with the same unhurried movement she'd used to stand up, her hands visible and relaxed at her sides. She didn't seem startled or defensive, which somehow made Webb more suspicious rather than less. In his experience, innocent people usually showed some kind of reaction when confronted by military authority. They got nervous, started explaining themselves, tried to justify whatever they were doing. Maya just looked at him with those dark eyes, waiting to see what he wanted. "Is there a problem, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that Webb couldn't quite place. Not foreign, exactly, but not local either. The kind of voice that suggested someone who'd lived in a lot of different places, picked up pieces of different regional dialects without settling into any particular one. Webb pulled out his tablet, swiping to the security checklist he'd developed for situations exactly like this one. "I observed you photographing base security infrastructure," he said, making a note on the screen. "That requires proper authorization and clearance documentation. I'm going to need to see your orders, your security badge, and any permits you might have for conducting surveillance activities." Maya blinked once, slowly, like someone processing information that didn't quite make sense. "Surveillance activities," she repeated. Not quite a question, but not exactly a statement either. "I was looking at a damaged fence. Thought someone should know it needs proper repair." "Right," Webb said, his tone suggesting he'd heard that excuse before. "And taking photographs of security vulnerabilities would be part of that assessment, I suppose." He held out his hand expectantly. "Documentation, please." Maya reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a folded set of papers, the temporary orders that had gotten her through the front gate. They were legitimate as far as they went, signed by the right authorities, stamped with the right seals, but they were also deliberately vague about her specific purpose on base. The kind of orders that gave someone permission to be somewhere without explaining exactly why they needed to be there. Webb examined the papers carefully, comparing the information to something on his tablet. Maya Chen, temporary duty assignment, authorized for base access pending final processing. No unit designation, no specific job description, no security clearance level indicated. In Webb's mind, this was exactly the kind of administrative sloppiness that created security vulnerabilities. People showing up with half-complete paperwork, claiming to have legitimate business, but unable to provide clear documentation of what that business actually was. "These orders don't specify what you're supposed to be doing here," Webb pointed out, handing the papers back. "They don't authorize you to examine security installations or document potential vulnerabilities. As far as I can tell, you're supposed to be in processing, not conducting unauthorized reconnaissance of base infrastructure." Maya folded the orders and tucked them back into her pocket. "I wasn't conducting reconnaissance," she said patiently. "I saw something that looked dangerous and wanted to make sure the right people knew about it." That fence is going to fail if it takes any real stress. Webb made another note on his tablet. And you determined this, how exactly? What's your background in security assessment or structural engineering? The questions came out sharper then. He'd intended, but he was getting frustrated with her calm responses. Most people would be showing some sign of nervousness by now, some indication that they understood the seriousness of the situation. Common sense mostly, Maya replied. Wrong. Gauge wire, improper tension, weak points where the original structure was compromised. Doesn't take an engineering degree to see it's a temporary fix that won't hold up under pressure. Common sense, Webb repeated, making it sound like an inadequate qualification. Well, common sense would also suggest that unauthorized personnel shouldn't be examining security barriers in the first place, regardless of what they think they see. He looked up from his tablet, studying her face for signs of deception or guilt. What I'm wondering is why someone with no apparent military background and no clear assignment would be wandering around photographing our defensive perimeters. Maya's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A hardness that hadn't been there before, like armor sliding into place. No apparent military background, she said quietly. That's an interesting assumption. Webb felt a moment of uncertainty, but pushed through it. He'd committed to this course of action, and backing down now would undermine his authority. Your orders don't indicate any military service, he said. No rank, no unit history, no service record attached. If you've got relevant experience, now would be the time to mention it. Would it matter? Maya asked. Would you take my word for it, or would you assume I was lying to get out of trouble? The question caught Webb off guard. He'd been expecting denials or explanations, not this kind of direct challenge to his assumptions. I'd expect you to provide documentation, he said after a moment. Same as anyone else making claims about their qualifications or background. Maya nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer. And if the documentation was classified? If the relevant records weren't available through normal channels? She wasn't being confrontational exactly, just matter of fact, like someone laying out the parameters of a problem. Then you'd need to go through proper channels to get clearance to discuss it. Webb replied, falling back on regulation responses. Chain of command exists for a reason. Security protocols exist for a reason. I can't just take your word that you're authorized to be doing whatever it is you think you're doing. Fair enough, Maya said. She looked around the area, taking in the damaged fence, the motor pool beyond it, the various buildings and structures that made up this section of the base. So what happens now? Do you want to escort me somewhere, or should I just continue with my day? Webb hesitated. In his mind, he'd been building up to some kind of dramatic conclusion, a moment where he'd uncover whatever deception was taking place and demonstrate his value as a security officer. But Maya wasn't giving him anything to work with. She wasn't. Lying that he could detect, wasn't being evasive or hostile, wasn't doing anything that clearly violated regulations. She was just being present in a way that made him uncomfortable. What I want, he said finally, is for people on this base to follow proper procedures, to go through appropriate channels, to respect the fact that we have protocols in place for good reasons. His voice was getting louder, attracting attention from some enlisted personnel who were walking past on their way to morning assignments. Maya noticed the audience too, but her reaction was different from what Webb expected. Instead of seeming embarrassed or defensive about being called out publicly, she just looked tired. Like this was a conversation she'd had too many times before, in too many different places, with too many different people who were absolutely certain they knew what they were looking at. You're right, she said, loud enough for the passing soldiers to hear. Protocols matter. Chain of command matters. Following proper procedures matters. She paused, meeting Webb's eyes directly. What also matters is paying attention to actual problems instead of creating new ones, Because someone doesn't fit into the categories you're comfortable with. Webb felt heat rising in his face. This wasn't going the way he'd planned, and the fact that they now had an audience made it worse. He'd intended to demonstrate leadership and security consciousness, but instead he felt like he was being lectured by someone who had no business telling him anything about military procedures. "What I'm comfortable with," he said, his voice tight. "With controlled anger, is people following regulations. Is clear lines of authority and responsibility. Is knowing who's supposed to be where and why they're supposed to be there." He gestured toward the fence with his tablet. "What I'm not comfortable with is unexplained personnel conducting unauthorized activities in sensitive areas." Maya looked at him for a long moment, and Webb had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing something he didn't want her to see. Not just his frustration or his anger, but something deeper. Something about the way he needed this confrontation to validate his sense of purpose and authority. "Unauthorized activities," she repeated. "Like noticing when something's broken and thinking maybe someone should fix it." She shook her head slightly, not dismissive exactly, but disappointed. "You know what, Lieutenant? You're absolutely right. I should have gone through proper channels. Should have filed a maintenance request through the appropriate office and waited for someone with the right paperwork to come examine the obvious safety hazard." Webb nodded, feeling like he was finally getting somewhere. "That's exactly what should have happened. There are procedures in place for reporting maintenance issues, security concerns, any kind of infrastructure problems. Following those procedures ensures accountability and prevents unauthorized access to sensitive information." "And how long do those procedures typically take?" Maya asked. "From initial report to actual repair, a week, a month? How many people walk past this fence every day while we're waiting for the paperwork to make its way through the system?" The question annoyed Webb because he didn't have a good answer. He knew the maintenance backlog was substantial, knew that non-critical repairs often took weeks or months to complete. But that wasn't the point. The point was following proper procedures, maintaining good order and discipline, ensuring that everyone operated within established chains of command. "The timeline isn't relevant," he said. "What's relevant is following established protocols and respecting security procedures. If everyone just decided to take matters into their own hands whenever they thought they saw a problem, we'd have chaos." Maya was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence again, then back at Webb. When she spoke, her voice was very calm. "You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. Can't have people just taking matters into their own hands." She paused. "So what would you like me to do now?" Webb straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of authority settle around him like a familiar uniform. This was exactly the kind of moment his training had prepared him for, a clear situation requiring decisive leadership and proper enforcement of military protocol. He glanced at his tablet, scrolling through the disciplinary options available to him as the officer in charge of base security and maintenance. "What I'd like," he said, his voice carrying across the motor pool area, "is for you to understand that actions have consequences. That wandering around this base without proper authorization, photographing sensitive installations, and then questioning established procedures when called on it isn't acceptable behavior." Maya stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, watching him with that same calm expression she'd maintained throughout their entire interaction. She didn't look defiant or apologetic, just attentive, like someone waiting to hear what came next. That patience, that complete lack of visible anxiety, somehow made Webb more determined to establish his authority. "Since you seem to have time to conduct unauthorized inspections of base infrastructure," Webb continued, pulling up a duty roster on his tablet, "and since you clearly need a better understanding of how things work around here, I'm assigning you to remedial facility maintenance. Consider it an educational opportunity." Several enlisted personnel had slowed their pace as they walked past, not obviously eavesdropping, but close enough to hear the exchange. Webb was aware of the audience and played to it, speaking loudly enough to ensure his words carried. This was about more than just one person's behavior. It was about setting an example, demonstrating that proper military order would be maintained regardless of who thought they could ignore established protocols. Specifically, Webb said, making a show of consulting his tablet and making official notations, "You'll be responsible for complete sanitation and maintenance of facility. Block C, that's the Latrine complex behind the command building. I want every surface cleaned, every fixture sanitized, every tile scrubbed until it meets inspection standards." Maya nodded once, a small movement that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and complete absence of surprise. "Understood, Lieutenant. Is there a specific timeline for completion?" Webb had expected protests, arguments, maybe even an appeal to his sense of reasonableness. The fact that she simply accepted the assignment without complaint threw him off. Balance for a moment. Most people would have tried to negotiate, would have pointed out that they weren't actually military personnel subject to his authority, would have demanded to speak to someone higher up the chain of command. "I want it completed today," he said, recovering his composure. "And I want it done to standard. Real standard, not whatever you think is good enough. When you're finished, you'll report back to me for inspection." He paused, looking around at the small crowd that had gathered. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before deciding that military protocols don't apply to you." "Yes, sir," Maya said. Quietly, the words carried no sarcasm, no hidden defiance, just simple acknowledgement of an order received and understood. She looked around the area one more time, her gaze lingering briefly on the damaged fence, then back to Webb. "Should I requisition cleaning supplies through normal channels, or is there an expedited process for disciplinary assignments?" The question was entirely practical, delivered in the same neutral tone she'd used throughout their conversation. But it highlighted something Webb hadn't considered. He'd been so focused on making his point about authority and consequences that he hadn't thought through the logistics of actually implementing the punishment he'd assigned. "Supply shed behind the commissary," he said after a moment. "Tell them Lieutenant Webb authorized emergency cleaning supplies for Facility Block C. They'll know what you need." He made another note on his tablet, officially documenting the disciplinary action for his records. Maya nodded again. "Anything else, Lieutenant?" Webb looked at her carefully, searching for signs of resentment or anger that he could address, but her expression remained completely neutral. It was unsettling, this complete absence of emotional reaction to what was clearly intended as public humiliation. Most people would be showing some sign of how they felt about being dressed down in front of witnesses, but Maya just stood there waiting for further instructions. "Just remember what we discussed about following proper procedures," Webb said. "Finally, about respecting chain of command and working within established systems. That fence will be reported through appropriate channels and repaired when maintenance schedules permit." "Understood," Maya replied. She glanced once more at the damaged section of perimeter barrier, then back to Webb. "Will there be anything else?" Webb shook his head, already mentally composing the incident report he'd file later. This had been a good morning's work, a potential security issue identified and addressed, proper military discipline maintained, and a clear message sent about the importance of following established protocols. The kind of leadership his superiors would appreciate when they reviewed his performance. Maya turned and walked away without another word, her stride unhurried and purposeful. She didn't look back, didn't make any gestures that might be interpreted as disrespectful, just headed in the direction of the supply shed with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown since arriving on base. The small crowd of onlookers dispersed gradually, returning to their own duties with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed proper military justice in action. Webb watched her go, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. The satisfaction came from having successfully handled a disciplinary situation, from demonstrating leadership and maintaining good order. The unease was harder to identify, something about Maya's complete lack of reaction, her willingness to accept consequences without protest or explanation. It wasn't what he'd expected, and unexpected reactions always made him uncomfortable. Facility, Block C, sat at the far end of the base, a squat concrete building that housed the main latrine complex for enlisted personnel. It wasn't the worst facility on the base, but it wasn't pleasant either. Fluorescent lighting that flickered intermittently, ventilation that worked sporadically, and the permanent smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying odors of heavy use. Maya arrived there about an hour later, carrying a canvas bag full of cleaning supplies and wearing the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout her encounter with Webb. She stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the space with the methodical attention of someone planning an approach to a complex task. The facility was empty at this time of day, most personnel being occupied with morning duties, which gave her the privacy to work without interruption. She set her supplies down near the entrance and began systematically examining each section of the facility, not looking for problems or deficiencies, just getting a clear picture of what needed to be done and in what order. The work itself didn't bother her. She'd done far worse jobs under far worse conditions, and there was something almost meditative about having a clear, achievable objective with measurable results. Maya started with the sinks, working from left to right with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She stripped off her outer shirt and rolled up the sleeves of her t-shirt, revealing arms that were lean and muscled in a way that suggested regular physical training, rather than casual fitness. Her movements were economical and efficient, no wasted motion, no hurried attempts to get through the work quickly. The morning heat was already building, and the concrete building held the temperature like an oven. Maya worked steadily despite the discomfort, pausing occasionally to drink water from a bottle she'd brought, but never stopping for extended breaks. She cleaned each fixture thoroughly, not just removing visible dirt, but sanitizing every surface according to proper military hygiene standards. As she worked, Maya found herself thinking about Lieutenant Webb and the encounter that had led to this moment. She'd met dozens of officers like him over the years, young, earnest, absolutely convinced that their authority was both necessary and beneficial. Most of them weren't bad people, just inexperienced people trying to apply classroom lessons to real-world situations that were more complex than their training had prepared them for. Webb had made assumptions based on incomplete information, had responded to uncertainty with aggression, and had chosen public confrontation over private conversation. All predictable behaviors for someone who measured success by his ability to maintain control over his environment. Maya didn't take it personally. She'd learned long ago that other people's need to exercise authority usually had more to do with their own insecurities than with anything she'd actually done. The work progressed steadily through the morning. Maya moved from sinks to stalls, scrubbing each surface until it gleamed, replacing supplies that had run low, fixing minor maintenance issues that she encountered along the way. She worked with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, not thinking about anything except the task at hand, focused entirely on meeting the standards Webb had demanded. It was just after noon when she heard footsteps approaching the facility. Heavy boots on concrete, the measured pace of someone conducting an official inspection. Maya glanced toward the entrance but continued working, not wanting to interrupt her progress for what was likely just a routine check. Lieutenant Webb appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, wearing the same expression of professional skepticism he'd shown earlier. He'd come to inspect her work, to ensure that his disciplinary action had achieved the desired educational effect. In his mind, this was the logical conclusion to the morning's events, a demonstration that proper military standards would be maintained regardless of individual preferences or objections. But as Webb stepped into the facility and began his inspection, something caught his attention that made him stop mid-stride. Maya was kneeling beside one of the back stalls, scrubbing the base of a urinal with intense concentration, her right sleeve pushed up almost to her shoulder. And there, wrapped around her forearm in dark, precise lines, was something that made Webb's breath catch in his throat. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a specific tattoo, with symbols and designs that Webb recognized from his military education, from classified briefings he'd attended, from stories that were told in whispers among officers who'd served in certain theaters of operation. The kind of ink that wasn't decorative, wasn't personal expression, wasn't anything that could be obtained by walking into a commercial tattoo parlor. Webb stood frozen in the doorway, his tablet forgotten in his hands, staring at Maya's exposed forearm with growing comprehension and mounting horror at what he might have just done. The tattoo wrapped around Maya's forearm like a living thing, dark ink forming intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the fluorescent light. Webb's military education kicked in, his mind automatically cataloging the symbols he could make out from his position near the doorway. A winged caduceus intertwined with crossed swords, surrounded by script in a language he couldn't read but recognized as Arabic. Below that, barely visible where her sleeve had bunched up, the distinctive outline of what looked like a unit patch, not the standard geometric designs of regular military units, but something organic, predatory. Webb's mouth went dry as the implications began to sink in. He'd seen similar markings exactly once before, during a classified briefing at Officer Candidate School. The instructor had shown slides of various unit identifications, including some that were so classified their very existence was compartmentalized. Information: Special Operations Medical Personnel, combat medics attached to units that didn't officially exist, people who operated in the spaces between what the military acknowledged and what actually happened in the field. Maya continued working, seemingly unaware that her sleeve had ridden up or that Webb was standing frozen behind her. She attacked a stubborn stain with methodical precision, her movements economical and practiced. There was something almost ritualistic about the way she worked, like someone who had learned to find meditation in repetitive physical tasks. Muscles in her exposed forearm flexed and relaxed as she scrubbed, making the tattoo seem to move, to writhe under her skin. Webb tried to reconcile what he was seeing with his earlier assessment of Maya as an unauthorized civilian wandering around. The base. The woman kneeling on the concrete floor, elbow deep in cleaning supplies, didn't match his mental image of elite special operations personnel. She was too quiet, too unremarkable, too willing to accept menial assignments without protest. But the ink on her arm told a different story, spoke of experiences and qualifications that existed far outside the normal military hierarchy. He took an involuntary step backward, his boots scraping against the concrete. The sound echoed in the confined space, sharp and startling. Maya's hand stilled for a moment, then she slowly turned her head to look over her shoulder. Her expression was calm and unsurprised, like she'd been aware of his presence the entire time. "Something wrong, Lieutenant?" she asked, her voice carrying the same neutral tone she'd used throughout their earlier confrontation. She didn't seem to notice that her sleeve had shifted, didn't make any move to cover the exposed tattoo. Webb's training told him to maintain composure, to project authority regardless of changing circumstances. But his training had never covered situations like this, had never prepared him for the possibility that someone he'd been treating as a disciplinary problem might actually be someone whose background was so classified he wasn't supposed to know. It existed. "I was just ... He started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. He couldn't admit that he'd been staring at her tattoo without acknowledging that he recognized what it meant. And recognizing what it meant would require him to acknowledge that he'd potentially made a catastrophic error in judgment. Maya studied his face for a moment, taking in his pale complexion, the way his hands were trembling slightly as he gripped his tablet. She glanced down at her own arm, noticing for the first time that her sleeve had shifted position. Her expression didn't change, but she made no immediate move to cover the exposed ink. "You recognize it," she said quietly. Not a question, just a statement of fact. Webb's throat felt like it was closing up. He tried to speak, managed only a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at words. Maya watched him struggle for a moment, then turned back to her cleaning without any apparent urgency. "Most people don't," she continued conversationally, applying cleaning solution to another section of tile. "It's not the kind of thing they teach in regular military education. Too many questions about operations that officially never happened, units that don't appear on any organizational charts." She paused in her scrubbing, looking at a particularly stubborn stain with professional interest. "The Arabic script is a verse from the Quran," she said, her voice still calm and educational. "Something about protection in dark places. The medics in my unit all got it after our third deployment. Seemed appropriate at the time." Webb finally found his voice. "Your unit," he managed to croak. Maya nodded, still focused on her cleaning. "Medical evacuation and trauma response. Attached to various special operations groups depending on mission requirements. We went places where regular medical personnel couldn't operate, retrieved people who weren't supposed to be where they were in the first place." She sat back on her heels, examining her work. The section of floor she'd been cleaning was spotless, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Officially, we were part of a medical research and development program. Unofficially, we were the people they called when someone needed to disappear from a situation that was about to go very badly wrong." Webb felt like the floor was shifting under his feet. Every assumption he'd made about Maya, every justification he'd used for his earlier behavior, was crumbling in real time. "How many ... He started, then stopped, realizing he might be asking for information he wasn't cleared to receive. "How many operations?" Maya asked, correctly interpreting his incomplete question. "Classified. How many people we brought home?" "Alive," also classified. "How many of us are left from the original unit?" She glanced at him over her shoulder. "That one's easy. 6, and 2 of those are in long-term medical care." She returned to her cleaning, moving to the next stall with the same methodical precision. "The unit was disbanded 3 years ago. Budget cuts, they said. But really it was because too many people in Congress were asking questions about operations they didn't have clearance to know about. Easier to shut us down than explain what we'd been doing." Webb stood paralyzed, watching Maya work with growing horror at the magnitude of his mistake. He'd ordered someone with a background in special operations medical evacuation to clean latrines as punishment for examining a damaged fence. Someone who had risked her life repeatedly in classified operations, who had pulled wounded personnel out of situations that regular military units couldn't even access. "I didn't know," he said finally, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Maya paused in her scrubbing, considering his statement. "No," she agreed. "You didn't know. You also didn't ask. You saw someone who didn't fit your expectations and decided that meant they didn't belong. Made assumptions based on appearance rather than taking the time to gather actual information." She moved to the sink area, beginning to clean the mirrors with the same attention to detail she'd shown everywhere else. It's a common problem in military leadership. People get so focused on maintaining control, on enforcing their understanding of how things should work, that they stop paying attention to how things actually work. Webb watched her reflection in the mirror she was cleaning, noting the way she moved with unconscious precision, the economy of motion that spoke of extensive training in environments where efficiency could mean the difference between life and death. "What should I have done?" he asked. Maya met his eyes in the mirror. "Ask questions, listen to answers." considered the possibility that someone might have legitimate reasons for being where they are, doing what they're doing. She returned to her cleaning. Assumed competence until proven otherwise, rather than assuming incompetence until proven otherwise. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Webb understood that he was being given a lesson in leadership, but it was a lesson that came at the cost of acknowledging his own fundamental failure in judgment. He'd been so concerned with projecting authority that he'd forgotten the purpose authority was supposed to serve. "The fence," he said suddenly. "You said it was dangerous." Maya nodded. "Wrong gauge wire, improper tension distribution, stress. Points where the original damage wasn't properly addressed before the repair was attempted. It'll hold under normal conditions, but any significant impact will cause catastrophic failure across a much wider section than the original damage." She finished cleaning the mirror and moved to the next one. In a combat zone, that kind of repair would be considered a tactical vulnerability, something that enemy forces could exploit to create a much larger breach than they'd be able to achieve through direct assault on an intact barrier. Webb felt sick. Not only had he dismissed a legitimate security concern, he'd punished the person who'd identified it. "How do you know so much about perimeter security?" "Part of the job," Maya replied simply. Medical evacuation operations often required rapid breach and extraction techniques. We had to understand defensive barriers in order to get through them quickly when time was critical. Learn to identify weak points, structural vulnerabilities, places where a small amount of applied force could create large openings. She paused in her cleaning, looking directly at Webb. The fence repair was done by someone who understood basic maintenance, but not tactical implications. Functional for normal use, catastrophically inadequate for security purposes. The kind of thing that happens when you focus on making something look fixed rather than actually fixing it. The parallel to their current situation wasn't lost on Webb. He'd focused on making himself look like he was maintaining security rather than actually understanding what security required. Had prioritized the appearance of authority over the effective exercise of leadership. Maya returned to her work, apparently content to let him process the implications in silence. The facility was nearly finished now, every surface gleaming, every fixture properly sanitized. She worked with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained throughout the morning, giving no sign that their conversation had affected her emotional state. Webb remained frozen near the entrance, tablet forgotten in his hands, watching someone whose qualifications and experience far exceeded his own methodically complete the menial task he'd assigned as punishment for questioning his judgment. Maya finished cleaning the last mirror and stepped back to survey her work. The entire facility gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every surface sanitized to hospital standards, every fixture polished until it reflected the overhead lighting like brushed metal. She'd gone beyond what Webb had demanded, transforming what had been a functional but unremarkable military latrine into something that could pass the most stringent inspection. Webb remained near the entrance, still processing the revelation of Maya's background and the implications of his earlier behavior. He watched as she gathered her cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision she'd applied to the work itself, every item accounted for and properly stored. There was something almost ceremonial about the way she organized the tools, like someone who had learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "It's finished," Maya said simply, not looking at Webb as she spoke. She pulled a small towel from her cleaning kit and began wiping down her hands and forearms, the action inadvertently drawing attention to the tattoo that had changed everything. The ink was darker now that her skin was damp with perspiration, the symbols more clearly defined against her olive complexion. Webb forced himself to look away from the tattoo, focusing instead on the transformed facility around them. Maya had exceeded every standard he could have reasonably expected, had turned what was meant to be punishment into a demonstration of professional competence that left him feeling even more inadequate than before. "I need to inspect it," he said. Finally, his voice hoarse from the tension of the past several minutes, the words felt hollow, meaningless. What was he going to find wrong with work that obviously surpassed military standards? How was he going to maintain any pretense of authority over someone whose qualifications so clearly exceeded his own? Maya nodded and stepped aside, giving him clear access to examine her work. She didn't hover or offer explanations, didn't point out particular areas where she'd gone above and beyond his requirements. She just waited, patient and professional, while he went through the motions of an inspection they both knew was unnecessary. Webb moved through the facility slowly, checking surfaces and fixtures with growing discomfort. Everything was perfect. More than perfect, it was the kind of thorough, professional work that reflected genuine expertise and pride in accomplishment, rather than mere compliance with orders. He found himself looking for flaws, not because he expected to find them, but because finding them would give him some way to reassert the authority that had been slipping away from him, since he'd recognized the significance of Maya's tattoo. "Supply cabinet," he said, grasping for something to critique. "Did you organize the cleaning supplies?" Maya looked toward the metal cabinet where janitorial supplies were stored. "Restocked what I used, organized remaining supplies by function and frequency of use. Standard inventory management procedures." Webb opened the cabinet and found himself staring at a perfectly organized array of cleaning supplies, each item properly labeled and positioned for optimal accessibility. It was the kind of organization that spoke of someone who understood logistics at a fundamental level, who had learned to manage resources in environments where running out of critical supplies could have life or death consequences. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He closed the cabinet door and continued his inspection, knowing he was going to find nothing to criticize, but unable to stop himself from looking. This was what authority was supposed to feel like. The power to evaluate, to approve or disapprove, to hold others accountable for meeting standards he had established. But the authority felt hollow when exercised over someone who had clearly demonstrated superior competence. "The floor drains," Webb said, kneeling to examine the metal grates that covered the drainage system. "Are they clear?" "Cleared of debris. Sanitized and inspected for proper water flow," Maya replied. "Also check the underlying drainage system for blockages or structural problems. Everything's functioning within normal parameters." Webb looked up at her from his position on the floor, noting the way she stood with perfect military posture, despite having spent hours on her knees scrubbing concrete. Her fatigue was visible in the slight dampness of her shirt, the way her hair had escaped from its regulation bun in small wisps around her face, but her bearing remained professional and alert. "You checked the drainage system," he repeated slowly. "That wasn't part of the assignment." Maya's expression didn't change. Seemed logical. Surface cleaning is only effective if the underlying systems are functioning properly. Poor drainage leads to standing water, which creates sanitation problems and structural damage over time. Webb stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his uniform trousers. He was beginning to understand that Maya didn't just complete assigned tasks. She identified and addressed underlying problems that others might not even notice. It was the kind of systematic thinking that came from operating in environments where overlooked details could have catastrophic consequences. "How do you know about drainage systems?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Field sanitation was part of our training," Maya replied. Medical evacuation operations often required establishing temporary treatment facilities in locations without existing infrastructure. We had to understand water management, waste disposal, contamination prevention, all the systems that keep people healthy in challenging environments. She gestured toward the floor drains with a slight movement of her head. Poor drainage in a field hospital means contaminated water mixing with clean supplies, which means infection risk for wounded personnel. Learning to identify and fix drainage problems quickly was a survival skill. Webb felt another piece of his earlier assessment crumble. Maya hadn't just cleaned the facility to standards, she'd applied specialized knowledge gained through military service that was orders of magnitude more demanding than anything he'd experienced. She'd treated his punishment assignment as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of professional competence that had kept people alive in combat zones. The assignment was to clean the facility, he said, trying to maintain some semblance of his original authority. Not to conduct a comprehensive systems assessment. Maya looked at him with that same calm expression she'd maintained throughout their interactions. "You asked for work that met inspection standards," she said quietly. "I delivered work that met inspection standards. If you wanted me to ignore potential problems I encountered in the process, you should have specified that in your initial instructions." The rebuke was delivered so mildly that it took Webb a moment to recognize it as a rebuke at all. Maya wasn't being insubordinate or challenging his authority directly. She was simply pointing out that he had failed to communicate his expectations clearly, and that she had responded by exceeding rather than merely meeting the standards he had established. Webb continued his inspection, moving through the facility with growing awareness that he was participating in a charade. Maya had transformed the space beyond anything he could have reasonably expected, had demonstrated professional competence that far exceeded his own in areas he was supposed to be responsible for. The inspection was meaningless, except as a way to delay the moment when he would have to acknowledge what had happened. "The work is acceptable," he said finally, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Acceptable. He was calling work that surpassed professional standards acceptable, and they both knew it was an adequate praise for what Maya had accomplished. Maya nodded once, acknowledging his assessment without comment. She gathered the last of her cleaning supplies and shouldered the canvas bag she'd brought with her. "Will there be anything else, Lieutenant?" Webb looked around the transformed facility one more time, trying to find words for what he was feeling. Guilt over his earlier behavior, embarrassment at having misjudged someone so completely, anger at himself for creating a situation that reflected poorly on his leadership abilities. But underneath all of that was something else, a growing awareness that Maya represented a kind of military professionalism he had studied in textbooks, but never encountered in person. "The fence," he said suddenly. "The damaged section you were examining this morning, you said it was dangerous." Maya's expression didn't change, but she waited for him to continue. "I want you to show me exactly what's wrong with it," Webb said, the words coming out in a rush. "Explain the problems you identified, the risks they present, what would be required to fix them properly." For the first time since he'd known her, Maya looked genuinely surprised. Not shocked or emotional, just mildly taken aback by an unexpected development. "You want me to conduct the assessment you said I wasn't authorized to perform?" Webb felt heat rising in his face. "I want you to share your professional opinion about a potential security vulnerability," he said carefully. "Based on your experience with systems assessment and infrastructure evaluation." Maya studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether this was another test or trap. "My professional opinion," she repeated slowly. "About perimeter security and structural integrity." "Yes," Webb said, committing fully to the course of action, even though he wasn't sure where it would lead. "Your professional opinion, based on whatever training and experience you have that's relevant to the situation." Maya shouldered her bag more securely and looked toward the facility entrance. "It'll take about 20 minutes to do a proper assessment," she said. "Document the problems, identify the risks, outline repair requirements. Is that what you're looking for?" Webb nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He was essentially asking Maya to do exactly what he had disciplined her for attempting earlier, but now he was framing it as a request for professional consultation rather than unauthorized surveillance. The distinction felt important, even though they both understood it was largely semantic. "Lead the way," he said, gesturing toward the door. Maya walked past him without comment, her stride purposeful and professional. Webb followed, acutely aware that the power dynamic between them had shifted in ways he was still trying to understand. He was no longer giving orders to someone he perceived as a security risk. He was requesting assistance from someone whose expertise far exceeded his own. As they walked across the base toward the damaged fence, Webb found himself watching Maya's movement, noting the way she automatically scanned their surroundings, the unconscious awareness of exits and potential threats that spoke of extensive training in hostile environments. She moved like someone who had learned to be constantly alert without appearing paranoid, professionally vigilant without being obviously suspicious. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the base was coming alive with the usual activity of a military installation going about its daily business. Personnel moved between buildings, vehicles navigated the road network, and the distant sound of training exercises carried across the desert air. It was a normal day on a normal base, but Webb felt like everything had changed since his encounter with Maya began. They reached the damaged fence section in silence, Maya moving with the same purposeful stride she'd maintained since leaving the Latrine facility. The morning heat was becoming oppressive, desert sun beating down on the concrete and asphalt surfaces until they radiated warmth like giant heating elements. Webb found himself sweating despite the early hour, his uniform sticking to his back. As he tried to match Maya's unhurried pace, Maya stopped about 3 feet from the fence and stood motionless for several moments, her eyes moving systematically across the damaged section. She wasn't just looking at the obvious repair work, she was examining the entire area, taking in details that Webb hadn't even noticed during his earlier patrols. The way the ground had settled around the fence posts, the stress patterns in the chain link mesh, the relationship between the damaged section and the structures on either side. "Show me what you see," Webb said, pulling out his tablet and activating the camera function. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with photographic documentation, but creating an official record felt like the right thing to do under the circumstances. Maya glanced at the tablet, then back at the fence. The original damage was caused by vehicle impact, she said, pointing to a section where the chain link had been compressed and twisted. Based on the pattern of deformation, something large backed into this section with enough force to bend the posts and tear the mesh. She moved closer to the fence, running her fingers along the twisted metal without actually touching it. The repair work focused on making it look fixed rather than actually restoring structural integrity. They used lighter gauge wire than the original construction, which means this section is now weaker than it was before the damage occurred. Webb aimed his tablet at the area Maya was indicating, trying to capture both the repair work and her. Explanation: how much weaker? Original specification was probably 12-gauge galvanized steel mesh with 8-gauge wire ties. Maya replied, examining the repair section more closely. The replacement work looks like 14-gauge mesh with standard 12-gauge ties. Under normal conditions, that's adequate for visual security and basic deterrence. She straightened up and stepped back, gesturing toward the fence line as a whole. But this isn't just a visual barrier. It's part of the base perimeter security system, which means it needs to withstand more than casual contact. The lighter gauge material will fail under significantly less stress than the original construction. Webb made notes on his tablet, trying to capture both Maya's technical assessment and his own growing understanding of how thoroughly he'd misunderstood the situation that morning. "What kind of stress are we talking about?" Maya pointed to the motor pool visible beyond the fence. "Line. Heavy vehicle contact, which is what damaged it originally. Weather loading from high winds, which are common in this area. Intentional breach attempts, which would be a concern in elevated threat environment." She paused, studying the repair work. "Also thermal expansion and contraction, which creates constant stress on all the connection points. She moved along the fence line, examining the areas adjacent to the repair section. The bigger problem is that the repair work didn't address the underlying structural issues. The posts that were bent in the original impact are still bent, which means they're not providing proper support for the mesh. The foundation work wasn't redone, so the entire section is less stable than it appears. Webb followed her movement, documenting everything she pointed out. He was beginning to see the fence differently, not just as a barrier that looked intact, but as a security system with specific engineering requirements that the repair work had failed to meet. "Walk me through what would happen if this section failed," he said, surprising himself with the request. An hour ago, he would have dismissed such speculation as unnecessary alarmism. Now he found himself genuinely wanting to understand the implications of what Maya was describing. Maya looked at him carefully, as if assessing whether he was genuinely interested in her analysis or setting her up for another confrontation. Whatever she saw in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because she moved closer to the fence and began pointing out specific vulnerabilities. "Cascading failure," she said simply. "The repaired section is now the weakest point in this entire stretch of perimeter. Any significant stress will cause it to fail first. But because the posts are compromised and the foundation work wasn't redone, the failure won't be contained to just the repaired area." She traced a line along the fence with her finger, indicating a section about 20 feet long. When the repair section fails, it'll create stress concentration at the connection points with the original fence. Those connection points will fail next, propagating the breach in both directions until it reaches structurally sound posts. Webb tried to visualize what Maya was describing. "So instead of a small hole, we'd end up with a large gap." "Potentially a very large gap," Maya confirmed. "And because the failure would be progressive rather than instantaneous, anyone attempting to breach the perimeter would have time to widen the opening or prevent repair efforts. What looks like a minor maintenance issue becomes a major security vulnerability." She moved to one of the bent posts and examined its base. "There's also the secondary effect on adjacent fence sections. When this fails, it'll change the load distribution across the entire perimeter segment. Other areas that are currently stable could become vulnerable to failure, creating multiple breach points from a single initial failure." Webb made more notes. His earlier frustration with Maya replaced by genuine appreciation for the depth of her analysis. She wasn't just identifying problems. She was thinking through the cascading effects and secondary consequences that his own security training had never covered in detail. "How do you know all this?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would involve more classified operations than he was cleared to hear about. Maya was quiet for a moment, still examining the damaged post. "Perimeter security was critical in our operational environments," she said finally. "We had to understand how defensive barriers worked, what made them effective, what made them vulnerable. Often had to establish or breach perimeter security as part of mission requirements." She straightened up and looked back toward the base buildings. "Also had to assess security vulnerabilities at sites where we were establishing temporary medical facilities. Understanding how barriers fail helped us position treatment areas to minimize exposure to indirect threats." Webb nodded, filing away another piece of information about Maya's background. Every detail she revealed painted a picture of someone whose training and experience encompassed areas he'd never even considered part of military medical operations. "What would proper repair look like?" he asked. Maya returned to the damaged section, pointing out specific areas as she spoke. "Complete replacement of the damaged mesh with material that matches original specifications. Straightening or replacement of compromised posts, depending on the extent of structural damage. Foundation work to ensure proper post stability and load distribution." She moved to the connection points between the repaired section and the original fence. New connection hardware to ensure the repaired section integrates properly with existing structure. Stress testing to verify that the repair can handle the same loading as the original construction. Webb took more photographs, trying to document both the current state of the fence and the areas Maya was identifying as requiring attention. Timeline for that kind of repair? Depends on resource availability and priority level, Maya replied. With proper materials and equipment, probably 2 days for a crew of 4. Longer if they have to wait for specialized materials, or if weather conditions interfere with foundation work. She looked at Webb directly. The current repair probably took half a day and cost a fraction of what proper repair would require. But it created a security vulnerability that's worse than leaving the original damage in place. Webb felt the implications sink in. The repair work had been done to make the problem appear solved while actually making it worse. It was a perfect metaphor for his own approach to leadership, focusing on the appearance of control rather than understanding the underlying issues that needed to be addressed. Cost of proper repair versus cost of security failure, he said, more to himself than to Maya. Exactly, Maya replied. False economy. Spend less money now, accept much higher risk later. In a combat environment, that kind of thinking gets people killed. She stepped back from the fence and looked at Webb. The repair work wasn't necessarily done with malicious intent. Probably just someone trying to solve an obvious problem with available resources and limited time. But good intentions don't change the fact that the solution created bigger problems than it solved. Webb understood that Maya was talking about more than just fence repair. She was describing the difference between addressing symptoms and addressing root causes, between creating the appearance of solutions and creating actual solutions. Recommendations? He asked, holding his tablet ready to record her response. Maya was quiet for a moment, looking back along the fence line toward the base buildings. Immediate recommendation is to post the area as a known vulnerability pending proper repair. Make sure security patrols are aware that this section can't be relied upon for perimeter integrity. She pointed towards several other sections of fence visible in the distance. Longer-term recommendation is systematic assessment of the entire perimeter. If this kind of repair work has been done elsewhere, there could be multiple vulnerability points that aren't obvious from casual inspection. Webb made notes, recognizing that Maya was outlining a comprehensive approach to base security that went far beyond his original concern about unauthorized photography. Anything else? Maya looked at him carefully, as if weighing whether to continue. Training recommendation, she said finally. Whoever authorized the original repair work needs to understand the difference between cosmetic fixes and structural repairs. Good intentions aren't enough when dealing with security infrastructure. The words were delivered without obvious criticism, but Webb understood that he was included in that training recommendation. His approach to leadership, like the approach to fence repair, had focused on appearances rather than underlying effectiveness. Webb stared at his tablet screen, scrolling through the photos and notes he'd accumulated during Maya's assessment. Each image told the same story. What appeared to be adequate repair work was actually a collection of structural compromises that had created vulnerabilities worse than the original damage. He found himself thinking about his own leadership approach, wondering how many other situations he'd handled with the same focus on appearance over substance. I need to report this, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there earlier. Document the security risk, recommend immediate action, get proper repair work authorized. He looked up from the tablet to find Maya watching him with that same calm expression she'd maintained throughout their interaction. That's your call, Lieutenant, Maya replied. You're the officer responsible for base security and maintenance protocols. There was something in the way she said it that made Webb pause. Not sarcasm exactly, but a recognition that he was finally taking responsibility for the kind of decision-making his position actually required. She wasn't praising him or criticizing him. She was simply acknowledging that he was doing his job. Webb looked back toward the base buildings, calculating the chain of command he'd need to navigate to get proper repair work authorized. His immediate supervisor would want documentation, cost estimates, risk assessments. The base commander would want assurance that this wasn't part of a larger pattern of security vulnerabilities. And everyone in between would want to know why this problem hadn't been identified and addressed through normal inspection procedures. The original damage report, he said suddenly. When this first happened, there should have been an incident report, a maintenance request, documentation of the repair work. I need to find out who authorized the inadequate repair and why proper procedures weren't followed. Maya nodded. Chain of responsibility, she said. Understanding how the problem developed helps prevent similar problems in the future. Webb made another note on his tablet. The investigation was going to be complex, potentially embarrassing for whoever had cut corners on the repair work. But it was also necessary if he wanted to ensure that base security was actually maintained rather than just appearing to be maintained. Question, he said, looking back at Maya. When you first examined this fence, when I found you taking photographs, did you already know all of this? Had you already identified the full scope of the problem? Maya considered the question carefully. I recognized that the repair work was inadequate, she said. Saw enough to know it was a potential security vulnerability that needed proper assessment. But the detailed analysis we just went through, that required closer examination and more time than I had during my initial observation. Webb felt a flush of embarrassment. So when I accused you of unauthorized surveillance, you were actually trying to document a legitimate security concern. I was trying to decide whether it was worth reporting, Maya corrected. Didn't want to create problems for maintenance personnel who might have been doing the best they could with available resources. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't immediately obvious, especially when you're new to an environment and don't understand local procedures. The distinction was important. Maya hadn't been conducting surveillance or gathering intelligence for unauthorized purposes. She'd been trying to balance her professional obligation to report security vulnerabilities against her uncertainty about how such reports would be received by personnel who didn't know her background or qualifications. I owe you an apology, Webb said, the words coming out more formally than he'd intended. I made assumptions about your intentions, your qualifications, your right to be on this base. I treated you like a security threat when you were actually trying to help maintain security. Maya's expression didn't change. Apology noted, she said simply. What matters now is how you handle the situation going forward. Webb nodded, understanding that Maya wasn't interested in making him feel better about his mistakes. She was focused on ensuring that the underlying problems got addressed, that future security issues were handled more effectively than this one had been. I want to request that you assist with the comprehensive perimeter assessment you recommended, he said. Provide technical consultation for identifying other potential vulnerabilities. Help develop proper repair specifications. Ensure that we're addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. Maya looked at him carefully. That would require acknowledging my qualifications officially, she said. Explaining to your chain of command why a temporary duty assignment person has expertise in structural security assessment. Are you prepared for those conversations? Webb hadn't considered that aspect of the situation. Bringing Maya in as a technical consultant would require him to explain how he'd discovered her background, why he'd initially treated her as a disciplinary problem, and how the situation had evolved into a legitimate security assessment. The conversations would be awkward at best. Yes, he said after a moment. I'm prepared for those conversations. The base security is more important than my personal embarrassment over how this situation started. Maya nodded once, a small movement that somehow conveyed approval. I can provide technical consultation within the scope of my clearance and experience, she said. But I'll need official authorization from your chain of command. proper documentation of my role in the assessment, and clear boundaries around what information I'm authorized to access. Webb made notes about the administrative requirements. Getting Maya properly integrated into the security assessment would require paperwork, clearance verification, and coordination with multiple departments. But it was the right thing to do, both for base security and for making proper use of available expertise. Timeline? He asked. Depends on how quickly you can get authorization, Maya replied. The perimeter assessment itself could be completed in 3 or 4 days if I have access to base plans, maintenance records, and previous inspection reports. Longer if I have to work around operational security restrictions or limited access to documentation. Webb calculated the time required to navigate the bureaucratic requirements. A week to get proper authorization, another week for the assessment itself. 2 weeks total to have a comprehensive understanding of perimeter security status. Reasonable timeline, Maya agreed. Gives you time to address immediate vulnerabilities while working towards systematic improvement. They stood in silence for a moment, both looking at the damaged fence section that had started their interaction. Webb found himself thinking about the difference between reactive and proactive leadership, between managing problems and preventing them. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Maya waited for the question. When you first arrived on base, when you were walking around getting familiar with the layout, were you conducting an informal security assessment? Looking for problems that needed attention? Maya's expression remained neutral. I was observing, she said carefully. Getting familiar with the environment, understanding how things worked, noting anything that seemed unusual or potentially problematic. It's a habit from operational environments where situational awareness could be critical for mission success. Webb nodded. Maya had been doing exactly what a competent security professional should do when arriving at a new location, systematically assessing the environment for potential issues. But because she'd done it quietly, without announcing her qualifications or requesting official authorization, he'd interpreted her professional behavior as suspicious activity. How many other issues did you identify? He asked. Maya looked around. The immediate area, then back toward the base buildings. Several, she said. Nothing immediately critical, but various maintenance and security concerns that could become problems if not addressed systematically. Webb felt his stomach sink. Such as drainage issues near the commissary that could create structural problems during heavy rain. Lighting gaps in the motor pool area that create concealment opportunities. Vehicle barriers that have been damaged by repeated impact but not properly repaired. Maya paused. Communication equipment that's been installed without proper consideration of security clearances or signal interference. Each item Maya mentioned represented another area where Webb's security responsibilities weren't being adequately fulfilled. Not because he was negligent or incompetent, but because he'd been focused on regulatory compliance rather than systematic problem identification and resolution. I need a complete list, he said. Everything you've observed that could affect base security, operational efficiency, or personnel safety. I need to know what I've been missing. Maya studied his face as if assessing his genuine commitment to addressing the problems she'd identified. That list would be extensive, she said, and creating it would require me to document observations about base operations that go well beyond perimeter security. Webb understood the implication. Maya had been conducting the kind of comprehensive security assessment that should have been part of his regular duties as the officer responsible for base security. She'd identified problems he should have found himself, using expertise he should have been developing through his own professional education. I need the list anyway, he said. I need to understand the full scope of what needs to be addressed, even if it's embarrassing to admit how much I've been missing. Maya nodded slowly. I can provide that assessment, she said. But it should Be done through proper channels with official authorization and clear documentation of the process. Not as an informal consultation, but as a legitimate security review. Webb made more notes on his tablet, outlining the administrative steps required to convert Maya's informal observations into an official security assessment. The process would be complex and potentially uncomfortable, but it was clearly necessary. "One more question," he said. "If I had handled our initial encounter differently, if I had asked about your background instead of making assumptions, would you have been willing to share this kind of assessment from the beginning?" Maya considered the question carefully. "Probably," she said. "But it would have depended on how the conversation went, whether you seemed genuinely interested in base security or just in demonstrating your authority. People with my kind of background learn to be careful about when and how we offer professional opinions." Webb understood. Maya's willingness to help had been contingent not just on his authorization to request assistance, but on his demonstrated commitment to actually using that assistance effectively. She'd been evaluating his leadership as much as he'd been evaluating her presence on the base. The walk back to the command building passed in contemplative silence, both Webb and Maya processing the implications of what had transpired at the fence line. Webb found himself acutely aware of details he'd previously overlooked: scuff marks on building corners that suggested vehicle impact, drainage grates that were clogged with debris, lighting fixtures that had been damaged and inadequately repaired. It was as if Maya's systematic approach to observation had somehow transferred to him, making visible problems that had been hiding in plain sight. As they crossed the main courtyard, Webb noticed personnel beginning to take notice of their interaction. Not obviously staring, but the kind of subtle attention that suggested word was spreading about the morning's events. A group of enlisted soldiers slowed their pace slightly as they passed, their conversation dropping to whispers. A sergeant emerged from the motor pool office and watched their progress with obvious curiosity. Maya seemed oblivious to the attention, maintaining the same unhurried stride and neutral expression she'd shown throughout their interaction. But Webb was beginning to understand that her apparent obliviousness was actually professional awareness. She was undoubtedly noting every detail of their observers while giving no indication that she was doing so. "Lieutenant Webb," a voice called from behind them. Webb turned to see Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, approaching from the direction of the administrative building, his expression suggesting he had information to share. "Sergeant," Webb replied, stopping to acknowledge the senior enlisted man. Maya halted as well, positioning herself slightly behind and to the side in a way that kept both men in her line of sight, while maintaining a respectful distance from their military conversation. Rodriguez glanced at Maya, then back to Webb. "Sir, Colonel Morrison wants to see you in his office. Says it's regarding some kind of incident report that needs immediate attention." The sergeant's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes kept drifting to Maya with obvious curiosity. Webb felt his stomach tighten. News of his confrontation with Maya had apparently reached the base commander, which meant he was about to have some very uncomfortable conversations about his handling of the situation. Did he say anything about the nature of the incident? "No, sir, just that it involved temporary personnel and potential security concerns." Rodriguez's gaze settled on Maya again. "Ma'am, the colonel asked me to escort you to his office as well, if you're available." Maya nodded once. "Of course, Sergeant." Webb's mind raced as they walked toward the command building. Colonel Morrison was known for his direct approach to leadership issues, his intolerance for poor judgment, and his particular concern for anything that might affect base security. Having to explain how he'd ordered a qualified security professional to clean latrines as punishment for trying to report a legitimate vulnerability was going to be one of the most difficult conversations of his military career. The command building buzzed with the usual activity of military administration, personnel moving between offices with folders and tablets, phones ringing with routine business. the background hum of air conditioning systems working against the desert heat. But Webb felt like everyone was watching him as he walked toward the colonel's office, though he couldn't tell if that was reality or paranoia. Colonel Morrison's office occupied a corner of the building with windows overlooking both the main gate and the motor pool area. It was decorated with the usual military memorabilia, unit patches, photographs from various deployments, awards, and commendations that spoke of a long and distinguished career. Morrison himself was seated behind his desk reviewing a folder when Sergeant Rodriguez knocked and announced their arrival. "Come in," Morrison called, not looking up from his paperwork. "Close the door behind you." Webb entered first, followed by Maya, both maintaining proper military bearing as they positioned themselves in front of Morrison's desk. The colonel continued, reading for several moments, the silence in the office broken only by the muffled sounds of activity from the corridor outside. Finally, Morrison closed the folder and looked up at them. He was a man in his late 40s, weathered by years of military service, with the kind of direct gaze that seemed to see through whatever facade people tried to present. His attention moved from Webb to Maya and back again, taking in details that Webb suspected revealed more than he wanted them to. "Lieutenant Webb," Morrison said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex problems. "I've received some interesting reports about your activities this morning. Something about unauthorized photography, disciplinary actions, and security assessments. Want to walk me through what's been happening?" Webb straightened his shoulders, knowing that honesty was his only viable option. "Sir, I encountered Miss Chen examining perimeter security this morning and made incorrect assumptions about her activities and qualifications. I assigned her to facility cleaning duties as a disciplinary measure, which was inappropriate given her background and the legitimate nature of her security concerns." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Inappropriate how? Webb glanced at Maya, who remained silent and professional. "Sir, Miss Chen has extensive experience with security assessment and infrastructure evaluation from previous military service. Her examination of the perimeter fence was professionally motivated, and her concerns about structural vulnerabilities were valid. My response was based on incomplete information and poor judgment." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying both of them. "Ms. Chen, is Lieutenant Webb's assessment of the situation accurate?" Maya spoke for the first time since entering the office. "Lieutenant Webb correctly identified that I was examining base security infrastructure without proper authorization. His response was consistent with standard security protocols for addressing potentially suspicious activity. The situation evolved as additional information became available about my background and the nature of my observations." Webb felt a flash of gratitude for the way Maya had framed her response. She hadn't thrown him under the bus or emphasized his mistakes, but had acknowledged the legitimacy of his initial security concerns while noting that the situation had become more complex as facts emerged. Morrison nodded slowly. "I see. And what did the security assessment reveal about our perimeter integrity?" Webb pulled out his tablet and accessed the photos and notes he'd accumulated. "Sir, we identified significant structural vulnerabilities in at least one section of perimeter fencing. Repair work that appears adequate, but actually creates greater security risks than the original damage. Ms. Chen recommends comprehensive assessment of the entire perimeter to identify similar problems." Morrison extended his hand for the tablet, reviewing the documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood the implications of security vulnerabilities. His expression grew more serious as he scrolled through the photos and notes. "These repairs were authorized through normal maintenance channels," Morrison said after several minutes. "Signed off on by the appropriate supervisors, completed by qualified personnel. Are you telling me that our standard procedures for infrastructure repair are inadequate?" Webb felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Sir, I believe the issue is more about expertise and specifications than procedures. The personnel who completed the repair work may not have had access to the specialized knowledge required to understand the security implications of their methodology. Morrison looked at Maya. "Miss Chen, what's your assessment of Lieutenant Webb's characterization?" Maya maintained her professional posture. "The repair work appears to have been completed with good intentions and adequate materials, but without full understanding of the structural and security requirements. It's a training and expertise issue rather than a procedural failure." Morrison set the tablet aside and leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, I've been trying to get clarification on your background and qualifications since you arrived on base. Your orders are legitimate but unusually vague, and your personnel file has more redactions than a classified intelligence report. Want to help me understand what kind of expertise we're dealing with here?" Maya was quiet for a moment, and Webb could see her weighing her response carefully. "Sir, I have experience with security assessment, infrastructure evaluation, and emergency repair procedures from previous military assignments. The specific details of those assignments are classified, but the skills are applicable to current security concerns." Morrison nodded, apparently satisfied with the carefully diplomatic answer. "And you're willing to assist with a comprehensive security assessment of base infrastructure?" "Yes, sir, with proper authorization and within the scope of my clearance and experience." Morrison looked back at Webb. "Lieutenant, I want you to coordinate with Ms. Chen on a complete perimeter security review. Proper documentation, official authorization, full assessment of vulnerabilities and repair requirements. This goes beyond just fixing one section of fence. I want to know if we have systematic problems that need systematic solutions." Webb felt relief and apprehension in equal measure. He was being given the opportunity to address the security issues properly, but also being held accountable for ensuring the assessment was thorough and professional. "Sir, what timeline do you need for the assessment?" Morrison checked his calendar. 2 weeks for initial findings, 1 month for comprehensive report and repair recommendations. "And Lieutenant?" Webb straightened. "I want regular updates on your progress. This is the kind of issue that can become a much bigger problem if it's not handled correctly." The administrative machinery of the military moved with surprising efficiency. Once Colonel Morrison had given his authorization, within 48 hours, Maya found herself with a temporary security clearance upgrade, access to base infrastructure plans, and a small office in the engineering section where she could conduct her assessment work. Webb had been assigned as her military liaison, responsible for coordinating access to personnel, facilities, and documentation. Maya approached the comprehensive security assessment with the same methodical precision she'd applied to cleaning the Latrine facility. She began by studying base blueprints and maintenance records, creating a systematic inventory of every structure, barrier, and security installation on Fort Sentinel. Her temporary office filled with maps, photographs, and charts as she documented patterns of wear, repair, and potential vulnerability across the entire installation. Webb found himself learning more about military infrastructure in those first few days than he'd absorbed during his entire officer training. Maya's approach to security assessment was holistic, considering not just physical barriers but also sight lines, traffic patterns, communication systems, and the interaction between different security elements. She thought about problems the way someone who had operated in genuinely dangerous environments, where theoretical vulnerabilities could quickly become life or death realities. The perimeter fence was just the most obvious issue, Maya explained during one of their morning briefings. She'd spread maps across her desk, marking locations with different colored pins to indicate various types of concerns. But the real problem is systematic. Maintenance decisions are being made in isolation, without consideration of how individual repairs affect overall security posture. Webb studied the map, noting the concentration of red pins along the southern perimeter. "What am I looking at here?" Maya pointed to a cluster of markings near the motor pool. Vehicle barriers that have been damaged and repaired multiple times, but never replaced with properly engineered solutions. Each repair weakens the overall system while making it appear functional. Under stress, these barriers won't perform as designed. She moved her finger to another section of the map. Communication equipment installed without proper consideration of security clearances or electromagnetic interference. Some of these installations actually create vulnerabilities in adjacent systems while solving local communication problems. Webb made notes on his tablet, recognizing that Maya was describing a base-wide pattern of short-term thinking that had created long-term security risks. Recommendations? Priority system, Maya replied immediately. Categorize all identified issues by risk level and resource requirements. Address critical vulnerabilities immediately. Schedule systematic repairs for medium priority items and develop long-term replacement plans for infrastructure that can't be adequately repaired. She pulled out another map, this one showing the base's electrical and communication systems. Also need integrated planning. Stop making decisions about individual systems in isolation. Every infrastructure change should be evaluated for its impact on overall security posture. Webb looked at the complexity of what Maya was proposing and felt overwhelmed by the scope of the problem she'd identified. Timeline for implementation? Maya considered the question carefully. Depends on resource allocation and command priority. Critical items could be addressed within weeks if there's sufficient commitment. Systematic improvements would take months or years, depending on budget constraints and operational requirements. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Sergeant Rodriguez entered, carrying a folder and wearing an expression that suggested important news. "Ma'am, Lieutenant, I've got the maintenance records you requested. Also got word that Colonel Morrison wants to see your preliminary findings this afternoon." Webb felt his stomach tighten. 2 days into the assessment, and they were already being asked to brief their findings to the base commander. Did he say what specifically he wants to discuss? Rodriguez shook his head. Just said he's had some questions from higher command about base security posture, and he needs current information about potential vulnerabilities. Wants both of you in his office at 1400 hours. After Rodriguez left, Webb looked at Maya with concern. Are we ready to brief preliminary findings? Do we have enough information to make meaningful recommendations? Maya was already organizing her materials. We have enough to identify the scope of the problems and outline a systematic approach to addressing them. That's probably what the colonel needs for his conversations with higher command. Webb spent the next several hours helping Maya prepare their presentation, learning to see the base through her systematic assessment methodology. Every photograph told a story about maintenance philosophy, resource allocation, and organizational priorities. Every map revealed patterns of decision-making that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had created cumulative vulnerabilities. At precisely 1400 hours, they found themselves back in Colonel Morrison's office, this time accompanied by the base's senior maintenance officer and the security chief. Morrison had cleared his conference table, providing space for Maya to spread out maps and documentation. What do we have? Morrison asked without preamble. Maya began her presentation with characteristic directness. Systematic security vulnerabilities resulting from maintenance practices that prioritize immediate functionality over long-term integrity. We've identified 43 specific issues requiring attention, ranging from critical safety hazards to moderate security concerns. She pointed to various locations on the base map. The perimeter fence issue that initiated this assessment is representative of problems throughout the base infrastructure. Repairs that appear adequate but actually create greater vulnerabilities than the original damage. Morrison leaned forward, studying the map. 43 issues. How many are critical? 11 require immediate attention, Maya replied. These represent situations where current repairs or installations could fail catastrophically under stress, creating security breaches or safety hazards that would affect mission capability. The senior maintenance officer, chief warrant officer, Thompson, looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, with respect, our maintenance procedures follow established military standards. Every repair is documented and approved through proper channels." Maya nodded respectfully. "The procedures are sound, Chief. The issue is expertise and specifications. Many repairs require specialized knowledge about security implications that isn't typically part of standard maintenance training." She pulled out a photograph showing the vehicle barrier repair. "This installation meets normal engineering standards for load-bearing capacity. But from a security perspective, the repair methodology creates failure points that could be exploited by someone with knowledge of structural vulnerabilities." Thompson studied the photograph, his expression shifting from defensive to interested. "You're saying the repair is structurally sound but tactically inadequate?" "Exactly," Maya confirmed. "Good engineering, insufficient security analysis. The solution isn't to criticize the quality of work, but to ensure that security considerations are integrated into repair specifications from the beginning." Morrison made notes on his tablet. Recommendations for addressing the critical issues. Webb stepped forward, referring to his own notes. "Sir, we recommend immediate assessment of the 11 critical vulnerabilities by qualified personnel, followed by expedited repair or replacement using security-appropriate specifications. We also recommend development of new protocols that integrate security assessment into all infrastructure, maintenance decisions." Morrison looked at the security chief. "Major Patterson, what's your assessment of these findings?" Major Patterson had been reviewing Maya's documentation throughout the presentation. "Sir, this level of systematic analysis hasn't been conducted since the base was established. If these vulnerabilities are accurate, we have significant exposure that needs immediate attention." Morrison closed his folder and looked around the room. "I want implementation plans for addressing the critical issues within 1 week. I want budget estimates for systematic improvements within 2 weeks. And I want new protocols for security integrated maintenance procedures within 1 month." He looked directly at Maya. "Ms. Chen, I'm extending your temporary assignment to oversee implementation of your recommendations. Lieutenant Webb will continue as your military liaison, with additional authority to coordinate resources and personnel as needed." Webb felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The assessment had been successful in identifying real problems and gaining command support for addressing them, but implementation would require sustained effort and careful coordination with multiple departments. Morrison stood, indicating the meeting was concluded. "One more thing. This assessment demonstrates the value of bringing in outside expertise for systematic evaluation of our operations. I want this to become a regular part of our security posture, not just a one-time response to identified problems." As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Webb realized that Maya's arrival at Fort Sentinel had initiated changes that would extend far beyond fixing a damaged fence. Her systematic approach to security assessment was becoming embedded in the base's operational procedures, ensuring that future maintenance decisions would consider both immediate functionality and long-term security implications. 6 weeks later, Webb stood at the same section of perimeter fence where everything had started, but the view was completely transformed. The damaged section had been replaced with properly engineered barriers that matched original specifications. The bent posts had been straightened and reinforced, and the entire stretch of perimeter showed evidence of systematic maintenance upgrades. More importantly, the repair work had been done with full understanding of security implications, creating barriers that were stronger than the original construction. Maya approached from the direction of the engineering building, carrying her ever-present tablet and wearing the same unremarkable civilian clothes she'd worn on that first morning. But her status on the base had changed dramatically. Personnel nodded respectfully as she passed, acknowledging not just her presence, but her expertise. She'd become an integral part of Fort Sentinel security infrastructure, consulted on everything, from routine maintenance decisions to major construction projects. Final inspection? She asked, joining Webb at the fence line. Webb nodded, making notes on his own tablet. Security Chief wants documentation that all critical vulnerabilities have been addressed. Before we brief the base commander on project completion, he gestured toward the repaired section. This one's obviously resolved, but I wanted to walk the entire perimeter one more time to verify everything meets your specifications. They began walking along the fence line, Maya pointing out details of the repair work and explaining how each modification improved both structural integrity and security effectiveness. The conversation was professional and focused, but Webb noticed a subtle change in their dynamic. Maya no longer needed to explain basic security concepts or justify her recommendations. Webb had learned to understand infrastructure from her perspective, to see problems and solutions through the lens of systematic security assessment. Vehicle barriers near the main gate are performing well, Maya noted, photographing the installation with her tablet. No signs of stress or settlement, proper integration with adjacent security systems. That repair should hold up under any reasonable impact scenario. Webb made corresponding notes, documenting the successful completion of what had been one of their highest priority vulnerabilities. What about the communication equipment modifications? Maya checked her tablet. All installations now meet electromagnetic compatibility requirements, and we've eliminated the interference problems that were affecting adjacent systems. More importantly, the new installation protocols ensure that future communication upgrades will be evaluated for security implications before implementation. They continued their inspection, moving systematically through each area where critical vulnerabilities had been identified. Webb found himself impressed not just by the thoroughness of the repairs, but by the way Maya had worked with base personnel to ensure that the solutions were practical and sustainable. She hadn't just imposed external standards, she'd helped the base develop internal expertise for maintaining security-appropriate infrastructure. As they approached the motor pool area, Chief Warrant Officer Thompson emerged from the maintenance office and walked over to join them. His initial skepticism about Maya's assessment had evolved into genuine appreciation for her systematic approach to infrastructure security. Maya Chen, Lieutenant, Thompson said, nodding to both of them. Wanted to update you on the drainage modifications near the commissary. We completed the work yesterday, and initial testing shows significant improvement in water management during heavy rain scenarios. Maya reviewed photographs on Thompson's tablet showing the completed drainage work. Excellent execution, Chief. The modified channel design should eliminate the standing water issues that were creating foundation risks. Webb noted the easy professional relationship that had developed between Maya and the base maintenance personnel. She'd managed to transfer knowledge and expertise without making anyone feel criticized or inadequate, focusing on systematic improvement rather than individual blame. Any issues with the new maintenance protocols? Webb asked. Thompson shook his head. Actually, the security integration requirements have improved our overall work quality. Having to consider long-term implications makes us think more carefully about repair specifications and material selection. The extra time investment upfront saves work later when repairs hold up better under operational stress. Maya smiled, a rare expression that suggested genuine satisfaction with the project's outcomes. That's exactly what we hoped would happen. Security-appropriate infrastructure is usually more durable infrastructure, which benefits everyone involved. As Thompson returned to his duties, Webb and Maya continued their perimeter inspection. The sun was setting behind the base buildings, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and gold. The base was settling into its evening routine, personnel completing daily duties and preparing for the transition to night operations. Question, Webb said as they walked. Looking back on everything that's happened, how do you assess the overall success of this project? Maya considered the question carefully. From a security perspective, we've eliminated identified vulnerabilities and established protocols to prevent similar problems in the future. From an organizational perspective, we've improved communication between security and maintenance functions and created systems for ongoing assessment and improvement. She paused, looking around the base. But the most important outcome is probably the change in how people think about infrastructure. Security isn't something that gets added on after construction or repair. It's integrated into every decision. From the beginning. Webb nodded, understanding that Maya was describing a fundamental shift in organizational culture that would have lasting effects beyond the specific repairs they'd completed. Personal assessment? Maya looked at him with that same calm expression she'd maintained throughout their interaction, but Webb thought he detected a hint of warmth that hadn't been there initially. You learn to ask better questions, she said simply. To gather information before making judgments, to consider expertise that doesn't come with obvious credentials. That's the kind of leadership that actually solves problems rather than just managing them. As they completed their inspection and walked back toward the command building, Webb reflected on how dramatically his understanding of leadership had evolved. The encounter that had started with his attempt to assert authority over someone he'd misjudged had become an education in the difference between real leadership and the appearance of leadership. Maya would be leaving Fort Sentinel the following week, moving on to another temporary assignment at another base that needed systematic security assessment. But the protocol she'd established, the expertise she'd transferred, and the changes in organizational thinking would remain long after her departure. Webb understood that he'd been given an opportunity to learn from someone whose experience and knowledge far exceeded his own, and that the lessons extended far beyond infrastructure security to fundamental questions about judgment, expertise, and the proper exercise of military authority. Have you ever witnessed someone completely transform a situation just by bringing professional expertise to bear on problems that others had learned to accept? Do you think real leadership comes from commanding respect or earning it through demonstrated competence? And how often do we miss opportunities to learn from people whose qualifications aren't immediately obvious? If stories about the power of quiet professionalism resonate with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content about recognizing excellence in unexpected places. 3 months after Maya's departure, Webb received an unexpected package at his office. Inside was a simple wooden plaque with an engraved message. To Lieutenant Webb, leadership is about making others better at their jobs, not proving you're better at yours. MC. Attached was a brief note explaining that Maya had been assigned to evaluate security protocols at a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, where her systematic approach had identified vulnerabilities that potentially saved lives during a security incident. The note concluded, "The lessons from Fort Sentinel are being applied in places where getting it right really matters." Webb kept the plaque on his desk as a daily reminder of how much he'd learned from someone he'd initially dismissed. 6 months later, when he was promoted to captain and assigned to a new base, his first action was to conduct a comprehensive infrastructure assessment using Maya's methodology. The damaged fence that had started everything had become legendary among Fort Sentinel personnel, not as a maintenance failure, but as the moment when the base learned to see problems differently. New personnel were often told the story during orientation, not to embarrass anyone, but to illustrate the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it appears. Webb never saw Maya again, but he heard occasional reports through military networks about her work at other installations. She'd become something of a legend herself, the quiet professional who could transform a base's security posture in a matter of weeks, then disappear as unremarkably as she'd arrived. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet competence completely changed your perspective? Share this story with someone who deserves more recognition than they receive. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more stories about the unsung heroes who make everything work better. Drop a comment telling us about a time when you learned not to judge a book by its cover. We read every single one.